over the course of the conversation, but those two immediately come to mind. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, sure.
This has been
questions?
Alexander from. Yeah, this has been from Maryland League Conservation Voters. So I feel that in recent years, at least there's been more serious talk and training or whatnot about this in the environmental community. Can you talk a little bit more about what effect that may have had in just recent times and some of the outlooks of trends moving forward? Can you speak a little bit more on that?
Sure. So you're thinking, so I'm going to go back a little and then I'll come forward. Then, one of them is that so the environmental movement, especially the mainstream side of the House, has sort of been talking about diversity and inclusion in fits and starts over the course of the last 30, 40, 50 years. And there have been moments in time, I think of the letter from the EJ groups to the major green groups, what was that, 1990, 1999, was another flurry of activity around this. And here's another one, but I think what is fascinating now, especially for a couple of reasons, it's the recognition that the demographics are finally actually really starting to shift, and people are actually starting to see that shift happen more quickly in the U.S., and I think that's helping to propel some of this. I also will say that given current political rhetoric and other things, I think it's also helping to increase people's recognition of that the value that they express about this actually needs to be shown in action. And so I think both of those things are helping to really spur this work, and I've gotten probably more requests around candidates, diversity and inclusion consultants, or anything else in the last 6 months than I've ever seen, really, in the environmental movement. And I think it's also the recognition of the need to ensure that the sustainability of the environmental movement is on par with everything else, which is like we need this movement to go on for a long time. And we need as many people to be engaged and involved in this movement as possible. And I think that's then spurred a lot of organizations to really take a close look at themselves and to say, okay, so what are we doing to contribute to this, or what do we need to change to make this happen? And when I'd say that the future is fully yet to be written, but I'm really heartened by the number of organizations that have committed to either hiring consultants, to hiring diversity managers, to starting diversity committees, but to really thinking about how the strategy of their organization is going to be helped or impacted by their lack of diversity. But also including the equity and justice lens has also been quite fascinating. And I think it's an opportunity for people to recognize the breadth and depth of the movement, even if we've called it environmentalism for a long time, that it's bigger and broader than that. And then I think over time it will also shift as to who focuses on what, especially around the different kinds of diversity that we focus on. Like right now, especially people of color are sort of at the forefront, but that I expect and hope that all forms of diversity get included in all of the work that folks are doing that continues to push that forward for a long time to come, and that people start chipping away at all the kinds of diversity that is needed for this movement to survive. But I don't know if that answers your question, but hopefully that gets a little bit to the point.
Okay, thanks. I guess that gets it qualitatively, not quantitatively, but okay.
So did you want to know quantitatively?
Yeah, if there was any recent seeing of upticks or changes that might indicate some positive trends into the future, quantitatively.
So what I'd say is, from the statistics that we collected, the one that struck me most was actually on the board member side, and that's probably in part because of the Green Leadership Trust, which is a network of folks, people of color and indigenous folks who sit on the boards of the green groups, and I feel like that the board member number is one that's really fascinating to me because it was higher than I was expecting to be at this point in time. Now, is that a complete upward trend? I don't know. But the other catch is that we're probably not going to know for another 5 to 10 years truly what the trajectory of this is going to be. And my hope is that we slowly start matching national demographics in the United States and slowly start to get to like 35%, 36%, knowing that it's a moving target. But the trend line on something like this is like a 5-year trend horizon, so that it will take us a while until we know really are we moving up or if there's going to be any marketable change.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Other questions?
Hi, this is Kendall Crawford. I'm with the Sierra Club Virginia chapter. I know you were just kind of talking a little bit about timelines and the long-term nature of this work. And I know earlier you mentioned recognizing the limits of just diversity trainings, and so I was wondering, I guess, what you would suggest as for a timeline for assessments to take place and evaluations to take place, in addition to, of course, to ongoing trainings and workshops.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think the question becomes sort of what you're evaluating and what you're tracking. And one is, you can evaluate trainings is one piece, both before, after, and, 6 months out, depending on what it is. And making sure that you are accomplishing whatever goals you've articulated to actually have the training or workshop meet. And so that's one piece, but also, people often do surveys, sort of before a workshop and after a workshop, but it's like the 6 to 9 months out that's really going to be probably more helpful than not, because it also shows whether or not people actually took some of those learnings and actually put them into practice, and whether or not you're actually having an effect on behavior and then eventually on organizational culture and other things going forward. So that's one piece. Other evaluations are around, culture. Organizations, I used to be part of an organization that did essentially an organizational assessment, an employee sort of viewpoint survey every about 2 years. And it was great because they had almost 15 years of data to understand sort of where the organization was, where they're going, and when along the way they had changes or shifts around specific topic areas or focuses. Like there's one point where sort of work-life balance for a lot of the staff got really out of whack, and then they took really corrective measures based on that employee viewpoint survey to institute a work plan as a result of that, and then to evaluate that, especially that topic, another 2 years later to see if that actually made the change. And so that's another one. Others are around, simply the hiring recruiting process. How have your applicant pools changed? As the gentleman from the Alliance talked about, are you tracking those applicant pools? Are they shifting over time? What does that look like? And then to know whether or not you have leakages or blockages throughout the process, to know what changes. Another one is exit interviews. Federal government is less good at this. NGOs are better. Around doing exit interviews when people leave to try to understand what's causing them to leave. Are they staying in the movement, or are they going somewhere else for some other reason? What's going on here? To know also what's sort of happening across the board and across the organization when it comes to retention. And then, of course, there's the programmatic side of the house, which is where I'm sort of where I started my life on oceans and fisheries work. But then how throughout the programmatic work does diversity, equity, inclusion get incorporated? And then how are you evaluating your either outreach to communities, your partnerships, what they look like, and then your relationships? Are you really truly building sort of an equitable partnership, especially, in organizations like the Sierra Club versus, like Outdoor Afro or HECHO or something else that is a much smaller organization? how are you able to ensure that the partnership really creates that nice blend? And there are ways to document and measure that going forward that people are really starting to dig into right now. But it's a great question. Evaluation is a really important one that people often forget about until they've done something and then want to evaluate. And what I'd always say is start when you craft that goal or whatever project you're going to do with the evaluation in mind. Hopefully, Kimball, that helps. Other questions?
I think we have one coming in on the chat box. So let me see. So we have a question from Megan. It says, for the organizations that are working to incorporate equity intentionally within their organization, are there examples of organizations pushing it further to evaluate the privilege in which their organizations were founded?
Good question. I want to say there's some organizations that are starting to really talk about whether it's their founding itself or the way in which the sort of newish conservation movement got founded. And I'd say it's definitely starting to happen, especially with names of places and other things. And there's actually a great example right now, actually here in DC. And this is a non-environmental focus, so I'm just going to flag that for a minute. But Georgetown University went through this really fascinating process, and they're still trying to figure it out. But the recognition that Georgetown itself bought and sold slaves at one point, and are now trying to rectify that sort of point in their history, and went through a whole, probably almost year-long process to try to figure out what this means for the organization, what they do to address it, and what's the remedy. It takes that kind of both contemplative, thoughtful approach to thinking about that, and it's going to be a struggle. I mean, for a lot of these organizations, whether you're founded by Ding Darling or sort of have your roots in Teddy Roosevelt or any of the above, there is a need often to acknowledge both the wonder of the founding, but also to then pull out the stories of folks that have either gotten lost intentionally or unintentionally in that process and re-elevate those stories so that people see them on par with a lot of the others. And so I'm trying to think of, some folks are having some of these conversations internally. I'm not sure how public they are yet, to try to tackle some of those foundings. I think Sierra Club is one that comes to mind off the top of my head. I know they've had sort of the beginning of internal conversations around that. But other folks are starting to struggle with that question. But it's a question that the whole movement is also going to end up having to struggle with because of its founding. But it's a great question, and I'd say it starts with a conversation, and sometimes it's around names or like what you see, in your office. I went to actually visit someone's office yesterday, and they really tried intentionally, aside from having, wonderful landscapes and the wildlife, of trying to be more intentional about the people that they put up when they put people on their walls as a beginning of a first step, to also recognize visually the diversity that is in that founding. But Megan, if you have a follow-up, please let me know.
Thanks for that, Whitney. I'll let you know if Megan has any other follow-up questions. Anyone else have any questions?
Hi, this is Ben Alexandra again. I know, for example, Choose Clean Water put out a diversity toolkit. You know, Greenpoint 2.0 has had different studies, and I'm wondering if there is a suite of some more resources or toolkits or something that really gives step-by-step guides that you would recommend beyond what we've already kind of seen in years past. Is there any new, really cool toolkits or anything like that that you might recommend?
No, there's nothing that comes to mind off the top of my head. And what I will always say is, because this work is complicated, because if it were easy, we would have done it. It needs to also be tailored to the organization, because every organization has its own sort of nuanced either founding or culture, and that the tools need to match the organization. And there's some tools that are great for some organizations that are totally unuseful for others. And I think that's the thing that I always try to let people know, is that it has to match where you are and where you need to go. And what I'd actually encourage people to do is find a good consultant as well, if possible, to help with this work. Because somebody who's seen 30, 40, 50 organizations go through this, someone who has the sophistication to understand the nuance and to get where your organization is and where it goes. What I will say is there are tools for pieces of it, whether that be like a cultural assessment or other things that are available. But I'd say a full toolkit of like, how do you do this from start to finish? I've never really seen one, because I don't know that one would be incredibly useful for like any size organization. Sorry, that's not an elegant answer, but it's the best I got.
Okay, thanks.
Hey there, this is Kendall again. You mentioned that there were pieces of it. Could you at least share what those are?
So there are organizations that have you know, like the Clean Water Coalition, who've done this. I'd also say there's an organization, actually there's a consulting team of 2 women called the Avarna Group. And it's AVARNA Group, and these 2 ladies have put some of their resources online, and they're theavarnagroup.com. And in their resources, they do have, I think, like a hiring toolkit, which is a good, goodness, probably 10-pager, but it gives you really sort of the breakdown of a collection of things when it comes to thinking about your hiring practices. Green 2.0 did one on hiring as well, but mainly focused on executive search and a checklist with that. That's on our website. But I check out the Avarna Group, because there's some things, depending on the topic, that they also have some activities and readings and a few tools on their website as well. So that is one that I know of. It's one of the good resources I know of off the top of my head.
This is Rob Aldrich. I second that. The Avarna Group is very good. I've attended their webinars and spoken with the 2 principals, and they're very good, common sense, use plain language, but very good, comfortable approach to this whole thing. I really like their work.
The other organization, I would say, resources more on the side of articles and videos, but great like polling data, surveys, stuff like that, is the Center for Diversity in the Environment. They're known as CDE, and they have a collection of especially articles and research on their website as well. And they're cdeinspires.org. I can put this in the chat box. Wouldn't that be easier, right, for you guys? So those are 2 that come to mind.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Did you put the link to Avarna in the chat box?
Yep.
Too?
I just did them both. Yep.
No, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. But yeah, I think the challenge with this work is, if it were a silver bullet again, we would have done it. Probably decades ago. But the complications of this work it requires really time, effort, and thought. Other questions?
All right. Is that everyone? Okay. Well, Winnie, I want to thank you again so much for joining us today. I think this was probably the most meaningful discussion we've had on a webinar in a while, and a lot of participation as far as the question and answers go. So I know that really shows that a lot of people are thinking about this and really wanting to try and implement a lot of these fixes in their own organization. As you all know, we are, as a coalition, in the process of putting together a survey. We've been working with SKIO for the past year on a DEI survey that we're going to be releasing hopefully in the next couple of weeks to our members. The goal of this survey is really to understand where our coalition members are on DEI. And actually, I could actually turn this over to Mariah, who's sitting across from me and is kind of in charge of helping push this along. I think she has more details about this. So Mariah, why don't you give a little intro into our DEI survey that's coming up?
Sure. So the coalition has been working on this for a couple of years, since before I came on board. But Shantae has been working with SKIO and the Chesapeake Bay Funders Network to put together a DEI assessment to take a look at where we are as a coalition on diversity, equity, inclusion issues, and where we can go going forward. So the assessment should be coming out in the next couple of weeks. It's been delayed a little bit on our timeline. We want to make sure that we're getting enough feedback as possible. We presented a little bit about this during the conference and through other means. But again, the survey should be coming out in a couple of weeks. I'll be working with Shantae and some of our state leads throughout the watershed to push the survey out. And what we're really going to try really hard to do is to get every single person at different leadership levels to fill this out. So we want everyone on our steering committee to fill this out. We want everyone who is an executive director to fill this out, anyone who is a board member, any general employee to fill this out. We want every single person at every single level to fill this out. We really want to get a great range on what it is that we're working with and how we can move forward. But going further into the future, we'll be hiring a consultant so we can really take a dive deep into how we really want to address and assess DEI. So you will certainly hear from us, and we'll talk a little bit more about that tomorrow. The coalition is having a EJ call at 11 if you're able to make it. So stay tuned.
Great. Thank you, Mariah. Yeah, and I just want to reiterate again what Mariah was saying about how much we want everyone to participate in this survey. So once it goes out, we really would love your help pushing it out through your own organizations and getting as many people at that organization to fill it out and give their input. So if it's any more incentive, we are going to give one random person who fills out the survey a free registration to the next Choose Clean Water conference. So yeah, a little incentive doesn't hurt, but we're really hoping that everyone is going to want to fill this out to really help move the needle on this as a coalition. So, and if you have any questions about that survey, feel free to reach out to Mariah, and she can answer any of your questions. So, and I think, sorry, I'm looking at the chat box. I think we haven't gotten any more questions. So, I just want to thank you again, Whitney, for joining us. If anyone has any questions, Whitney, is it okay if I send around your contact information?
Way to throw me under the bus, Shantae. No, I'm just kidding. Yes, of course.
I know Whitney will be happy to talk to you about any of this. But yeah, I just haven't had a chance to really dive into the results of report. It's very interesting, and I can send around a link to that as well. So again, thank you all for joining us, and we look forward to hearing you on our next webinar next month.
Awesome.
Thank you,
all.
everyone.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Brittany. Thanks, all. Have a good one.